Our project is about the problem of runoff in Buck Gully. Buck Gully is a stream in Newport Coast that drains into the Little Corona Beach. People that live in the Newport Coast watershed pollute the storm drains in the area, and the polluted water then ends up in Buck Gully. This polluted water is also known as runoff. The definition of runoff is the water flow which occurs when soil is infiltrated to full capacity and excess water from rain, snowmelt, or other sources flow over the land. When the runoff is made up of contaminants, it is known as non-point source pollution. A watershed is the land area when runoff drains to a common point. When runoff runs along the ground, it can pick up contaminants from fertilizers such as nitrates, phosphates, and pesticides. Runoff is increased by rampant urbanization because water doesn't percolate through the soil to the unconfined aquifer. This water is then forced into streams where erosion and siltation are major problems. When nitrates and phosphates enter the water, it causes accelerated growth of aquatic plants and algae, which will in turn use all of the available oxygen in the water, which results in the death of many aquatic animals. Also, plastics end up, which takes hundreds of years to biodegrade and creates a threat to the ecology of the stream. The runoff, which dumps into the Little Corona Beach, completely degrades the water quality of the ocean and is a threat to people swimming in the water. It is primarily made up of H2O, nitrates, phosphates, dissolved oxygen, suspended sediment, pesticides, bacteria, ammonia, and other toxic chemicals. As for Buck Gully, we found high phosphate levels on every day we tested and on every point we tested in the gully. When we tested the water quality at the beach, there were higher levels of nitrate than in the heart of the gully. Also, dissolved oxygen levels were very low throughout, and ammonia was on the verge of being at dangerous levels for aquatic life. Other problems associated with runoff in Buck Gully are erosion, reduction in groundwater recharge, and a lower water table, which increases the length of droughts.
The tide pools are home to 700 types of seaweed, 50 species of slugs, and contain more than 3/4 of California's known gastropod species. There may be as many as 1,000 undocumented species living in the tide pools. The importance of tide pool life is immeasurable to humans. The tide pools, much like the Amazon rainforest, hold species both known and unknown that may hold the next miracle cure. However, if they go extinct, they are lost forever. One problem is that the tide pools are very fragile, and when algae and seaweed vanish, the habitat and breeding grounds for invertebrates go as well. This causes mollusks, mussels, and crabs to die off, and their loss ripples up the food chain to fish, birds, and sea mammals. Also, along with swamps and bogs, tide pools are considered to be one of the first locations where sea creatures evolved into land dwellers, making them important to evolutionary scientists as well. Tide pools can be divided into 5 zones. The first zone, the spray/splash zone, is where barnacles live. Here, the zone is flooded only by the highest tides and storm waves. Life here grows very slowly, so it requires stability and is vulnerable to pollution. The next zone, the high tide zone, is the area that is only submerged during high tide. Organisms here must survive rough waves and long exposure to air. Here, algae protect small creatures from the sun, and mollusks such as limpets and mussels attach themselves to rocks. Hermit crabs, which make homes for themselves in abandoned shells, also live here. Mid-tide zone is often covered and uncovered twice a day by the tides. Animals in this region have adapted to surviving in and out of seawater. When the tide goes out, anemones close up and mussels close their shells to keep in moisture. They open when the tide returns with food. Some sea stars can be exposed to air for up to 50 hours. Low tide zone. Because the low tide zone is usually covered by water, organisms here are not as sturdy and cannot tolerate much exposure to the air or sun. This stable environment has the greatest diversity of life of all the zones. Seaweeds provide shelter for many animals, including crabs, shrimp, and small fish. Sea slugs and urchins are more fragile than organisms in other zones.
Runoff containing pollutants such as oil, sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus are carried by storm drains that empty into the ocean. These pollutants can have disastrous effects on the environment and life in marine ecosystems. The environmental effects of runoff include algal blooms, eutrophication, and dead zones from increased nutrients. Also, increased turbidity reduces oxygen levels of the water and puts stress on aquatic organisms. Construction pollutants such as concrete, stucco, and lime can drastically affect the pH of water and limits the habitability of the water by wildlife. And Sediment buildup in runoff leads to erosion of the surrounding land. Runoff also affects humans. The more water pollution there is, the more the water must be treated, which leads to higher water prices. Oftentimes, taxes must increase to cover the cost of treatment of polluted water sources. Runoff contaminated with bacteria is also a major health risk. Polluted runoff that drains into the ocean can make the water unsafe to swim in.
Put a grate at the end of any slope in your yard to ensure the water soaks back into the ground and does not run into the street and into the storm drain. Reuse rainwater from a roof by creating a rain barrel to collect the water that rolls off and use that water for gardens and plants. Disconnect any gutters that lead directly to storm drains and either collect and use the water or reroute the water to an area of your yard that requires more water than the average rainfall. Do not leave any soil in your yard unplanted. Reduce the amount of lawn in your yard and replace with plants with larger root systems that are able to absorb more water. Replace plants with indigenous plants that are acclimated to the amount of rain in your area and need very little watering. Create a rain garden in an area near a heavily watered area that is lower than the surrounding land to collect any unused water from lawns or gardens. Plant with water-needing plants to avoid standing water. Sweep patios instead of hosing them down and collect any sweepings to stop them from entering the storm drains. Do not wash your car at home. Instead, take it to a car wash that recycles and reuses its water.
What is the major issue related to water quality in the Gully?
There's three big issues. We have a bacteria problem on the beach. If you go down on the beach, you'll see a little sign there that says, hey, think twice about swimming here because water quality's been kind of bad over the years. So that's a big deal for the city. For the city and the residents and the beachgoers, we want that sign removed. So I'm glad you guys are doing this. You get an idea of what the water quality's like. The second big issue is we have a fertilizer, nitrogen, phosphate problem. You can see algae. We were talking about algae a little bit ago. We don't want that algae showing up in the ocean either because
and up on tide pools.
In the tide pools because it's a big problem for them. The third problem that we talked about was the nutrients, pesticides, fertilizers. So it's chemicals, bacteria, and the algae, and water waste. You know, we gotta talk about that in these times.
Yeah. What have you done to do erosion control for the Gully?
Well, if you look right in here in front of us, you can see some of the erosion control we've done. These are fancy things. It's a French word called a gabion, and I'll explain to you what happens. If the water's clear up here, and that's, I don't know what that is, 800 feet of elevation, and it ends up on the beach. So the stream goes like this. It points down. As the water runs downhill, think of this being the bottom of the stream.
Sediment.
Yeah, it gains speed, and it scours the bottom and gets all the sediment. So what these gabions do is we're trying to slow down the water, but we still got to get to the bottom of the gully. So we drop it over the rocks because it can't erode the rocks. Then we let it go a little bit, then we drop it again. So we're making an artificial ramp, if you will. And we're trying to not erode the stream bed because then it erodes the banks and then we get big problems.